Okay, hello. Here we are with Baxter Hankin of Place Initiative, and we are going to be doing a city walkability rating today. You are in New York City, correct?
Correct. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I think this will be interesting. This might be the first New York City rating that we're doing at Pedestrian Space. So let's dive in. We usually do a walkability rating, a cycling rating, if you feel comfortable with that, and then public transit. And the scale is 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest and 10 the highest. So I will let you choose which one you want to rate first.
Great. Let's start with the walkability rating.
Okay. Go ahead.
I would give New York City walkability rating of 8. I would say that should I go into some of the reasons why?
Yeah, sure. And what reasons why, and then what would you need to see change to bring it up to a 9 or a 10?
Right. So for me, New York City has a walkability rating of 8. Almost all of the city is extremely walkable. You can walk for miles and miles through mixed-use areas in neighborhoods, both wealthy and less wealthy, and really almost the entire city is walkable. I don't give it a perfect score because of a couple of issues. First, particularly in Manhattan and some other parts of the city, there are really wide streets where there isn't really much of a need for cars at all. I think that Manhattan, the central part of New York City, could really function very well by limiting personal vehicles from almost every street. But the streets remain very wide in certain areas, especially the streets going north-south. Additionally, there are certain parts of the city that are divided by large highways cutting through neighborhoods, some of which were built in the place of streets that used to be main streets to neighborhoods that now no longer have main streets. So that's an issue in certain areas. And then third, the biggest issue for me with walkability here is probably the geography of the city. The city consists of Manhattan, which is an island in the center. To the east, there is another larger island that in the western portion of it contains the eastern part of the city, which is Queens and Brooklyn. To the north is a mainland area, which is the Bronx. To the west, across a river, is another mainland area, which is in a different state. That's in New Jersey. And to the south, there's another island, Staten Island. The width of the water between these different areas in almost every place the rivers are very wide. So even when there are places to walk across them, it's quite a distance to walk across them, and there's not even pedestrian facilities to walk across the rivers on all sides. So there's limited walkable connectivity between the different sections of the city, or as they're known here, the boroughs.
Okay. And it's interesting to hear your perspective because you also work with issues of walkable urbanism, which we'll get to later. But so what's next? Do you want to rate cycling or public transportation?
Let's go with public transportation next.
Okay.
So I would give the public transportation in New York City a score of a 6. New York City is definitely known for its public transportation. Some people might expect it to be higher. But the first issue, the system is not maintained very well. It has issues where it feels like it's falling apart. The trains are very old, and it's not very clean. There's also not been enough updates in recent years as accessibility for the disabled becomes more of an issue that people are thinking about, and a lot of the stations to the city subway are not accessible. You have to walk up and down stairs to get to them. Another issue is safety. That in the past few years, there have been a number of violent crimes on the subway that have really hurt the reputation of the subway and have also made it less safe for people as well. So one of the recent incidents, there was on one of the subway trains, there was a shooting where several people were shot in a subway car. So things like that definitely hurt the viability of the transit in the city. Additionally, then moving on to the way the whole transit system is set up, it's a hub and spoke system. So it's not entirely a hub and spoke system but for the most part it is. So you have all of these different transit lines converging in the center of the city in Manhattan, and there's very few transit lines that connect together the outer parts of the city itself, which is really a problem because the outer parts of the city are all separated from each other by wide rivers. So if you wanted to go, for example, from Brooklyn or Queens to the Bronx, you would have to take a subway into Manhattan and then back out again to the Bronx, which takes a really long time. Another issue with how the system is set up is because New York City is because the center of New York City is on the edge of the state line, and to the west of New York City across the Hudson River is New Jersey, which the portion of New Jersey facing New York City is still very urban and very walkable. The transit systems between the two states don't communicate very well with each other. So if you wanted to go from the eastern part of New York City west through Manhattan, all the way continuing west into New Jersey, there's no transit line that connects all the way through. You have to transfer at least once in Manhattan to continue going west, which is a major inconvenience, takes extra time. And so the connectivity there is a big problem. And these connectivity issues of how the system is set up not only make it very difficult for the outer boroughs of the city to interact with each other, but it also makes it very difficult for people who live in the outer boroughs of New York City that may have family or friends on the opposite side of the city, or even on an opposite side of the city outside of the city. For example, I have a friend who lives in Queens, which is east of New York City. In the eastern part of New York City, and she has to take a train west into Manhattan and transfer on that train to then go back northeast to her family in Connecticut. And that adds at least an extra hour to her trip unnecessarily. Wow. Yeah. So where her trip up to Connecticut to see her family is probably 2.5 hours. So that's an extra hour is a major amount of extra time. And one last issue with the connectivity is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City, Staten Island, has a subway line that does not connect into the main system. In order to get from Staten Island into New York City, you either have to drive over a bridge into Brooklyn, and then it's further into Manhattan, into the center of the city, or you take a ferry from Staten Island to Manhattan, which ferries don't have a lot of capacity, so it's a really inefficient way to do transit. So those are my reasons for the imperfect transit score.
Okay. Do you want to rate cycling?
I will briefly rate cycling. I I don't cycle in the city, and I have cycled in other cities, and there's a reason for that. The bike lanes here, almost none of them are separated bike lanes, and I know people who cycle in the city. They are often hit by cars. Uh, Being hit by a car in New York City, if you cycle, is inevitable. It's so frequent that I choose not to cycle here because it's just very unsafe. I have I have a rare separated bike lane on the street that I live on, but it's only separated with flimsy plastic bollards, and you see cars driving over them all the time. Additionally, in the non-separated bike lanes, the uh, um, the people who are driving their cars don't understand always that there's a bike lane there, because a lot of them are driving in from outside the city, so they haven't necessarily been very familiar with bike lanes. So they will often park in the bike lane, which forces the cyclist to swerve around the car into the lanes of traffic, which is also very unsafe. So I would rate cycling a 3. I'll give it a few points because the network of streets here is effective, and you can cycle here. And on the west side of Manhattan, there's a good separated cycling path along the river. But in general, it's not a good city for cycling, but it easily could be with a few changes.
That's a good point, that it could be with a few changes. Also, to close out, I'm looking forward to hosting you for a roundtable next month about your work, your project Place Initiative. So I'm wondering if you can share just a little bit about what Place Initiative is, the importance of walkable urbanism with this concept of climate resilience, and what you're doing through this project in identifying these cities.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to that roundtable as well. Place Initiative is an organization that looks at public policy at the intersection of 3 main issues: climate change, walkable urbanism, and social justice. And essentially, we see that walkable urbanism is a solution to climate change issues, and we intersect that with social justice, because we believe that you can't really solve for walkable urbanism and climate change unless it works for everyone. So the reason that we see walkable urbanism as a solution to climate change is really 2 parts. The first part, walkable urbanism is itself sustainable. It is itself environmentally sustainable by reducing the amount of land that you use per capita and reducing the amount of carbon emissions from transportation by prioritizing walking and transit and biking over personal vehicles. That really reduces your carbon impact and your contribution to climate change. Additionally, the reduced amounts of land use preserves more natural lands and of compact communities that allow walkable urbanism. And also, when you have compact communities, you're using less, you're running less miles of infrastructure per capita to support a community. And that's also more sustainable to be more efficient with your infrastructure in terms of embodied energy and operations. So walkable urbanism is itself sustainable. Then on the other side of things, in the future, climate change is going to impose a major burden on communities. And if communities are more resilient in the future, then then it's more likely that they may thrive in a future of climate change. And communities that are more compact and walkable use resources more efficiently and effectively, and therefore they're wasting less money, and they're less reliant on vehicles that use a lot of resources to operate and to maintain. And therefore, communities have the extra resources and efforts to spare when they aren't wasting their resources on suburban sprawl. And therefore, that makes communities more adaptable to the uncertainties of climate change. So we're looking at public policy from those two different angles. And in Place Initiative, I manage a project called the Climate Receiver Places Project, where we're looking to set policy direction for communities that will make them more resilient in a world of climate change, so that they're better situated to receive climate migrants and refugees from less safe and more at-risk areas.
Right, so you're identifying actual cities that, based on your research, are going to survive basically the effects of climate change better.
Yeah, exactly. We are identifying particular places that have lower climate risk in terms of climate disasters and other stresses that are increased from climate change. And we are trying to prepare those communities for growth in the future to receive climate migrants and refugees. And currently, our process of identifying communities that are well situated for this project and to work with us is using very imperfect data. So it's not a definitive list. And because of the data we have, and because our organization has limited scope, it's currently limited to the lower 48 states of the United States. But hopefully with some success, we can expand in the future.
Okay, yeah, that was something I wanted to note as well, that you're focused on North America and specifically the lower 48, but it will be really fascinating if you go global to hear about that also, because this is, you mentioned the future, but of course a lot of places globally are seeing the risk currently, right? We're seeing the effects of climate change and varying levels of disaster or in different global regions.
Absolutely. This project can and should be global, and hopefully we have the opportunity to expand in the future. I think that the United States is a very interesting place to start because the United States has such a major issue with sprawl and limited walkability and very wasteful communities. So it's extremely important that we turn around the momentum of the development patterns happening here, but this can apply everywhere.
Right. Really interesting. Well, thank you for your time. I look forward to the roundtable and to learning more about your work.
Thanks. I look forward to the roundtable as well.